Well, there was a glimmer of hope this morning for a few hours that the United States and North Korea may get back down on the road to, coming up with some kind of peace deal that would perhaps lead to mutual recognition and, stable diplomatic relations between the two countries, something that has never existed since the end of the Korean War. The U.S. really has never really existed or acknowledged that that North Korea is a real government. They've always been considered an enemy. It's just a matter of to what degree. So because of that, there's always been this risk of, war between the United States and North Korea. First because North Korea was, a communist country during the Cold War, and all communist countries were, enemies of the United States. But, since the end of the Cold War, a lot of those countries, the communist governments fell, or the communist governments have become a little more let's say, open to outsiders, like China. Even though the U.S. isn't getting along very well with China right now, China became very open to outsiders after the fall of communism, and certainly even before that, when Nixon went there and started up relations with communist China. And the same thing can be said of Vietnam. North Vietnam was a country that the U.S. was at war with for quite some time. It was a very bloody and traumatic war for the United States, but the U.S. gets along just fine with Vietnam. There's lots of trade that goes back and forth between the countries. There's people that go back and forth, and things get along just fine in terms of international relations. But with North Korea, they've never really been able to achieve that. And in fact, Donald Trump, just for trying, over the past couple of years, has been called a terrible traitor to Americans, someone who loves dictators and all this sorts of nonsense. Which, hey, if I were in Trump's shoes, I wouldn't care. People call me whatever I want. This is the right thing to do. It's better to have fewer enemies than more enemies. There's no reason to be mad at people because, North Korea is not going anywhere. They've been there for a long time. If you had asked me in the early 1990s, would I think that North Korea would still be around in the year 2019? I probably would have said absolutely not, because they're certainly one of the poor of of what was the communist world at the time. They're a pretty poor country. They're surrounded by China on one side, sure, but they're also surrounded by South Korea and Japan, two very modern and prosperous countries. And I would have thought that the pressures of those two countries being around them would have put some pressure on the North Korean regime and eventually led it to collapse. But it's still here. So as far as I'm concerned, the United States should stop trying to wait them out. The Kim family, the Kim dynasty, has been enshrined there, and I think they're going to be in power for quite a long time. And I think, frankly, the United States government has a lot of enemies, more than it needs, and, we don't really need to have the North Koreans as an enemy. They're not really a big threat, unless they feel threatened, because obviously North Korea is not going to launch, some kind of aggressive war against the United States, because that would be suicidal. So it's best for all sides that there's some kind of understanding and a long-lasting peace. Nobody will benefit from, there being this high tension and conflict between the two countries. So you would think, hey, it'd be pretty easy to hammer out some kind of agreement for both countries to say, okay, we're buddies now, or at least that we're not angry at each other anymore. You don't have to be best friends. But sadly, it doesn't seem as though that is to be the case, because the talks that were started up again today in Stockholm, Sweden, between the U.S. and the North Koreans have already ended. They made it less than one day. The North Koreans stormed out, and apparently they didn't feel that things were going to go pretty well, and so the talks collapsed just as soon as they began. And so, needless to say, based on this information, it seems as though the talks are going nowhere, and that the U.S. And the North Korean governments, they're not going to be buddies anytime soon. They're still going to be on sort of, if not a war footing, at least they're going to be on edge. Now, of course, these were the first talks between the U.S. and North Korea since John Bolton sabotaged the last talks in Hanoi, Vietnam. I was hoping that even though that the damage that Bolton did at that time, it was obviously significant, I was hoping that it wasn't irreparable. But it seems as though Bolton's influence is still carrying forward, and that what he did was not so easily repaired. The North Koreans have the same complaint now, really, that they had at the Hanoi summit, in which they also stormed out. They feel like the Americans are making unreasonable demands, which was certainly the case when it came to John Bolton. However, I don't know what the demands of the U.S. Were now. Perhaps it's just the North Koreans that they're going to say no to anything. I don't know. Perhaps that's a part of their strategy. They're playing hard to get. I don't know what the exact details were, but the North Koreans feel that the Americans brought nothing to the table, and that they offered nothing in the way of concessions. That it didn't feel like a two-way street to them. They just felt like the Americans wanted them to give up everything that they had on the table, all of their bargaining chips, without giving anything to them in exchange. But the good news is I don't know if this is perhaps a mistranslation, but the way the North Koreans put it is they saw that any deal has been delayed yet again, and using the word delay would seem to indicate that the chances of a deal are not entirely dead, and that the North Koreans don't see this as the end of things, but rather as just as they said, a delay. Now, an interesting angle from which to address this story is seeing it as a proxy of the China trade talks, because of course North Korea is a client state of China. North Korea would not exist without Chinese patronage, and the prospects of Trump making a deal with Kim Jong-un have long sort of been at least partially dependent on the willingness of Xi Jinping, the Chinese dictator, to put pressure on North Korea and sort of make them make a deal with the U.S. And there were times where it seemed like Xi was helping Trump a little bit, when Trump and Xi were getting along, and he was putting some pressure on North Korea to make a deal. And then there are times when it seems like Xi's not happy with Trump, and the North Koreans really aren't allowed to make a deal, even if they perhaps might want to. And so it would seem to many people, myself included, that if the Chinese wanted to make a deal with Trump in this next week, in which there are going to be trade talks, I believe, in Washington between the Chinese and the U.S., if they were interested in making a deal then, they probably would have urged the North Koreans to make some progress on their deal this week. And so we can sort of look at this as a preview of the China trade talks, and perhaps forecast that things are not going to go so well, which, I don't think that the trade talks are going to go anywhere anyway. As far as I'm concerned, both the chances of a North Korea deal and a trade deal before the 2020 election are pretty slim. I think that we're way too far away on a North Korea deal, that it would take way too much time, and that, Trump's not going to hammer one out in time for the election, for one, and for two, the trade talks deal. I don't think that that either side is going to come to an agreement that the other likes, just generally speaking. And two, from Trump's perspective, I don't think it makes sense to make a trade deal before the election, because I think he kind of wants that uncertainty up in the air. I think it helps him to have the ongoing talks, kind of like when a president is at war. People don't want to vote for the other guy because they don't want to destabilize the government at a time of war. It's kind of the same thing here. You don't want to change things up, when he's in the middle of the trade negotiations. Now, I don't necessarily know if that's the best tactic, but I could see how Trump might think that that'd be the case. Because a trade war is a lot like a real war. It's just, without the bullets. But yeah, despite what the North Koreans say, I'm going to say that the North Korean deal is pretty much dead as far as Trump's first term goes. If he gets reelected, maybe he'll try again. That could be like a legacy thing for him. Obama tried to make the Iran deal during his second term. Maybe that'll be Trump's equivalent of this. But it seems, based on things are going, that from the Chinese attitude, too, that they might be wanting to wait Trump out and see if he wins re-election, based on how the North Koreans just weren't even willing to talk to the U.S. In this past talk. So, again, prospects for a trade deal next week slim to none. Now, one last thing I want to add before I go is that the Trump administration is disputing the story about the talks between North Korea and the U.S. collapsing. Now, I haven't gotten any details on what their dispute is. I don't know if they're disputing that there's that there's somehow still negotiations going on or not. But there were lots of places that went out over the wire saying that the talks had broken down. So I haven't gotten enough details yet. And so if it does turn out that the talks between the U.S. and North Korea haven't broken down entirely, I will of course go over that tomorrow. But it seems to me like most of the reports are pretty certain that has in fact happened. So if you can get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.